Okay, well, so the topic for this week anyway is the Texas political culture. I think that's chapter 1 in the textbook. Um, so I want to begin with a um, just a simple definition. I think it's important when we start a new topic. Well, it probably won't happen with every topic that we cover this semester, but many of them, when we're introducing new concepts, it's important to start with a good definition, make sure that everybody's on the same page, understanding what we're talking about. So since this is a topic on the Texas political culture, it makes sense to me to start with a definition of what we mean by political culture. So this is, I think, pretty consistent with most of the textbooks and the way they define political culture. The set of political values, beliefs, and norms held in common by most members of the political community. Political culture is the set of political values, beliefs, and norms held in common by most members of a political community. Now, that doesn't mean that every person in the community has to hold the value or weight the value the same or define it exactly the same or whatever, but we're just talking about a general tendency here for whatever political community is that we're talking about. There's going to be some basic values, beliefs, and norms that they hold in common. All right? Now, that last couple of words there, political community, I think warrant a little bit further discussion. What do we mean by a political community? Well, in most modern societies, there are different levels of political community, and certainly that's true in the United States. We can talk about there being at least 3 levels of political community. Like there's this national political community, and then we can talk about, at the state level, and then at the local level. The word federalism, those of you who've taken the Government 2305 course, you know that it refers to a system of government in which powers are divided among levels of government, right? But we can also think about it in a cultural sense, right? That you have 3 levels of government. Yes, national government, state governments, and then local governments. But you also have 3 different levels of community: national level of community, state level, and then local level. Okay, and that's important for us to understand, because while all Americans hold some basic values in common, what we're going to discover as we go through today's class session and then in the Thursday class session is that the United States is a big enough society, it's a diverse enough society, that we find that there are some variations, right, in particular locations, whether at the regional level, the state level, or the local level. Okay, so let's start by talking about what some of the values are that Americans in general hold in common, whether they live in Texas or California or New York or Florida or any of the points in between. Okay, what are some basic values that Americans hold in common? This little visual that I've thrown up here on the screen for you is, I guess it probably illustrates my very limited creativity. I can't really think of a better way to illustrate this point to you. If somebody can, has some epiphany of, creative way to share this idea that I'm about to share with you, tell me, and maybe I'll start using it. But the basic idea that I'm trying to suggest to you here, and this is something that we go into some depth in the Government 2305 course, and we're not going to go into that kind of depth in this course, okay? But one of the things that I like to point out is that Americans generally hold liberal political values. Okay? That the dominant system of political thought really throughout American history, going back at least to the founding of the Republic in 1776, so through the national period, liberalism has really been the dominant system of political thought, and therefore liberal values really the dominant values. Now, before anybody gets too off put, okay, maybe you think of yourself as a conservative, and how dare I suggest to you that America is a liberal country, we have a liberal political culture, that liberalism is the dominant system of political thought. You know better that you are conservative, everybody you know is a conservative. I'm not using the term liberal here in the way that it's used in the popular political debate. And when we talk about liberals versus conservatives, I'm emphatically not using it that way. What we're referring to here is a system of political thought that asserts, that puts in sort of the highest, most preeminent, prized position the rights and liberties of individuals. Right? Think about the common root between the word liberal and liberty. Okay, so the American political culture is one that asserts as the first and foremost value the value of individual liberty, and that's probably something that even those people who think of themselves as conservatives can agree on, that liberty is really the preeminent value. I say, give me liberty or give me death. The phrase that's attributed to Patrick Henry, the Revolutionary period. Okay? What can be more American than the cause of individual liberty? But there are other values that liberalism adheres to, that liberalism articulates, and I've provided a list of some of those here, some of the more important ones. It's not a complete list or a comprehensive list, but in addition to the value of individual liberty, the value of order, equality, justice, rule of law, localism, republicanism, competitive individualism, private property, localism, nationalism, national unity, right? So all of those are values that Americans adhere to. And it may be that if we press people and ask them to define them, they may have a little bit of trouble. But I bet if we took some sort of survey, randomly sampled 1,000 Americans, and we asked them, do you believe that liberty is an important value of our society? Or do you believe that equality is an important value of our society, or justice, or whichever the ones you want to think of? There would be an overwhelming consensus. An overwhelming majority of Americans would say, of course, liberty is an important value. Of course, equality is an important value. Okay? So the way that Americans typically understand each of those values is consistent with the kinds of liberal assumptions and liberal ideas that became prevalent in the 18th century, during the period that historians refer to as the Age of Enlightenment. Have any of you taken a history class and remember learning about the Age of Enlightenment? Okay, so this is a period of Western history, European and American history, and mainly the 18th century, going back a little bit earlier, maybe lasting a little bit longer than that, but we're talking principally about the 18th century, the 1700s. And I think it's important to note that the political ideals that were developing during this period were really not unique or original to the minds of Americans. It really wasn't, the American founders who we can attribute the origins of these ideas to. It's really goes back to the British philosopher John Locke, but particularly the French philosophers, people like Voltaire and Montesquieu and Rousseau and some of these others. For those of you who said you remember learning about the Age of Enlightenment, maybe those names ring a bell for you. The Americans, like people like Jefferson, were particularly enamored of the French philosophers. And it's in the minds of these French philosophers that these ideas, these liberal ideas are really developed. And the Americans really jump on board, right? So that when they declare their independence in 1776, they are thoroughgoing liberals in the sense that we're talking about liberalism. Okay? And that really persists down to today to a large extent, that Americans, even into the early 21st century, accept the basic assumptions of liberalism. Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay? Well, if they're self-evident truths, why sit around and debate them? Why sit around and discuss them? We just accept them and move on. I've never heard anybody, even in as contentious as American politics seems to be today, I've never heard anybody trash the Declaration of Independence. Have you? Have you ever heard anybody, whether so-called liberals or conservatives, out there in the political arena debating this issue or that issue, saying, hey, have you ever read the Declaration of Independence? Can you believe the trash that's in that document? Why did we ever revere that thing? Americans today revere the ideas that are espoused in the Declaration of Independence as they did back in the late 18th century. So what I'm trying to suggest to you with my very poor, uncreative visual representation is that in any system of political thought, liberalism included, you have some fundamental assumptions. about human nature, about social life and social relationships, and then about the purposes and scope of government. But in American politics, we generally don't get debate at that level. Americans don't sit around and debate the fundamental assumptions about human nature, why we live in societies, and what is the nature of the relationship of the members of society to each other, what are the obligations of the members of society to society, or society to the individual. We don't sit around and debate that. We don't even really, to be honest with you, sit around and debate at a fundamental level why we have government and how much authority government should have. Jefferson tells us in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. He tells us why we have government. So we don't even debate that. Where we do get debate, though, in American political life is at this level, right? What's generally referred to as the superficial level. We don't get debate at that fundamental level like you do in some other societies. For example, through much of the 20th century in European countries, you had real political debate between communists and socialists and fascists and liberals. Communists and fascists have never had any real credibility in American political life. We've just sort of dismissed them because they make very different assumptions about human nature, society, and government. That just doesn't sound right to us, even if we don't think about it terribly hard. As I say, this is where we do get some discussion. Although it's not really debate over whether liberty is a value or should be treated as a value, or whether equality is a value or should be treated as a value, or justice or private property or any of these others. Most Americans accept these values. Where we do get some debate, though, is over how we prioritize them if there's a conflict, because we find that oftentimes these values come into conflict with one another. Maybe liberty and equality come into conflict with one another, or order and liberty come into conflict, or justice and private property come into conflict with one another. So when they do come into conflict, how do we, which is more important? So that's one area of debate that we get. We also get some debate over how to define them. What do you mean by equality? So we could get some debate there. But I think mainly where we see the debate is over the question of how we pursue them as a matter of policy. So you've got, when we talk about a value, we're talking about this ideal. And we can pick any of these here to illustrate this point, but let me just let me pick justice here. And we can think about justice, having multiple components. At a minimum, for example, we talk about it very narrowly, like the criminal justice, right? Criminal justice, or maybe more broadly, social justice. But let's just stay with the narrow thing, right? Criminal justice. So, we continue with our survey and we ask Americans, a sample of Americans, should we be committed to justice in our criminal law system, right? And I bet we get virtual unanimity that among those who respond that, of course, we should be committed to justice. Now, wait a minute, what do you mean by justice? Hold on a second, what do you mean by justice? Well, that's a fair question. And again, different people have different ideas, but I think at a minimum, what we tend to get is some idea, people articulate this idea that, well, it's about a system of laws, right? That we have this system of laws that are devoted to moral or ethical ends. That's one thing that we mean by justice. But then there's that other piece that says that everybody should be treated the same under the law. And again, I think if we ask our sample of 1,000 Americans, you would get virtual unanimity on that. Right? People are going to say, yeah, of course, everybody should be treated the same under the law. But if I followed up with a third question that said, is everyone treated the same under the law? Now what do you think we might get in response to our survey question? Is everyone treated the same under the law? I see a couple of people shaking their heads no. I don't see anybody shaking their head yes. Okay. So I think that those of you who shook your head no have a lot of company, because there are a lot of Americans out there who, when it comes to what we really see play out, is that you have the ideal of justice, equal justice under law up here, but what happens is something very different, that people aren't treated the same. What evidence do we have of that? Like what messes with that? What if we have this ideal that everybody should be treated the same under the law? We have this value, equal justice under law, but the reality is you're telling me that that doesn't actually happen. What evidence do we have of that? What about them?
Similar situations with different outcomes.
You're gonna have to elaborate just a little bit. I think you're on a good path here. Okay, but tell us, flush it out a little bit for us. Are you saying that if we take two people accused of the same crime, the facts are virtually, very similar, the charges are the same, that person A and person B might get treated differently by the criminal justice system based on what? What? Maybe on the basis of race or ethnicity. Okay. Anything else?
Gender.
On what?
Gender.
Gender, you said?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe. What else? What most people point to is how much money they have. Okay? I mean, many Americans are convinced that a wealthy person is going to get much better treatment, in the criminal justice system than somebody who is poor. So that's the point I'm trying to make. If we perceive that the reality is that you've got this idea of equal justice under law up here, but the reality is somewhere down here, right? Like we're just not there. There's one of two approaches that we can take, right? We can either throw up our hands and say, oh, well, we obviously can chuck the idea of equal justice under law because we just don't have that. And I hope that's not our approach, right? I don't think it is. I don't think we've gotten there. I don't think we've gotten that cynical yet. Oh, let's just chuck the idea of justice altogether because we're never going to get there. Or is the approach, what do we do in order to get there, right? What do we do to close the gap between the value and the reality? We want to make this come up, not this come down, right? If this is the value and this is the reality. Well, here's a thought for you. If we are so committed to equal justice under law, and we have this problem of, here's a case where this value is coming into conflict with justice, right? You're telling me that people who have a lot of property resources, people who have wealth, are going to get better treatment under law? So as long as we value this, it's going to be hard to get this. How about we do this? How about we just give everybody a public defender? Nobody can go out and hire their own attorneys, right? I'm just going to give everybody's going to get a bad defense. How about that? Do you see what I'm saying? Why shouldn't an individual who has accumulated lots of property resources be able to use those property resources to defend themselves against charges brought by the state? That's an important question. But if we're going to tolerate that, if we're going to tolerate wealthy people being able to pay for dream teams of lawyers, right, then we're probably going to come away with the sense that justice isn't meted out fairly, or it's not meted out equally. Okay, so that's the kind of debate that we tend to get in American political life. But again, it's not over the question of whether we should be committed to the value of justice or equality or any of the values that we have up here. Okay, so bottom line is the American political culture, the national political culture, is a liberal political culture. Okay, And that's true whether we're talking about people, Americans who live in Texas or California or Florida or wherever. I think that we would find, if we did a really good survey, we would find there's not much difference between the way Texans look at these values as opposed to the way that Californians look at these values, or people from Massachusetts or wherever they're from. But the United States is a big enough society, it's a diverse enough society that we would expect that there are some variations in political culture. And to that end, I want to introduce you to a culture scheme that was developed by a political scientist named Daniel Ellazar, originally way back in the 1960s. Professor Ellazar wrote a very influential book called American Federalism, A View from the States. I think the initial edition, the first edition, was like 1967 or 1968, and then there were subsequent revisions. But it was a very impactful book, certainly for political scientists, right? And one of the reasons for that is that he does introduce us to these three different variants of American political culture. I want to be clear here. Ellazar is not disputing that the American culture is liberal. It's a liberal political culture. But again, he's saying that a big enough, diverse enough society that we might expect that there are some differences. And he identifies these three main variants of American liberal culture, what he calls moralism. And we're going to define and describe these here in just a bit, but just very quickly here, I want to put this out there so you can kind of pin it, put a pin in it and remember it. He's not talking about religious morality here. He's talking about what we might call civic morality. So there is this variation of American liberal political culture that he calls moralism, a second one called individualism, and a third called traditionalism. Those are the three dominant culture types. However, he says that in any given place in the United States, you can have a mixing of culture types so that you have a dominant culture and then a strong subculture. And that means that you could have moralism as the dominant culture type, but individualism as the subculture, or individualism as the dominant culture type and moralism as the subculture, or individualism as the dominant culture type and traditionalism as the subculture. Traditionalism is the dominant culture type, individualism as a subculture, and finally, traditionalism as the dominant culture type and moralism as the subculture. I don't think that's exhaustive of the mathematical combinations. Are any of you really good at computing mathematical combinations? Maybe you could do that and tell us how many actual combinations mathematically there might be. He says these are the ones that actually exist. So if we had a map of the United States up here and we blindfolded you and you went up there like pin the tail of the donkey and you put a pin in in a particular spot on the map, and we see that you put your pin in, someplace in Arizona, right? Maybe Tucson, Arizona. We can say, oh, Ellazar says that there's a dominant culture type and a subculture type in Tucson, Arizona, right? Again, before we get to a description of each of these three types, I want to throw several maps out at you. Okay, here's the first one. This is a map indicating the three dominant culture types by state. Each state has a dominant culture type. According to Ellazar, each state has a dominant culture type, and maybe your eyes are immediately attracted to Texas. Okay, so that indicates Texas has a dominant traditionalistic culture. As you look at this map, this distribution of M's and I's and T's, do you notice any pattern? Any geographical pattern in the distribution? Anything jump out at you?
That the north is more moralistic.
Yeah, he says that moralism is really a characteristic of the northern tier states. Okay? This part is usually what jumps out to people first, okay? That the South is traditionalistic. And then it's less clear, but the middle tier is individualistic. So you kind of have this North moralistic, South traditionalistic, in between individualistic geographical manifestation of these culture types, which raises an interesting question. How did that happen? Well, he says that these three culture types really are established from the very beginning with the founding of the English colonies in America. And let me just digress here for just a moment, just in the interest of full disclosure. I'm going to be real honest with you about LSR's scheme here real quick. When he came up with this back in the mid-1960s, I think he was thinking exclusively about the contributions of Anglos to the American political culture. I don't think he gives a whole lot of thought to the contributions of Latinos. I don't think he gives a whole lot of thought to the contributions of non-Europeans, to be quite frank. I think if he was still, I think he's deceased. If he was still alive and he, updated, had a new edition, I think he would probably have to take those into account. At any rate, just be aware that it's a very Eurocentric culture scheme. But we can modify from there, okay? So he says that these three types of political culture are established from the very beginning, the founding of the English colonies in America, so that the southern colonies were traditional and the middle Atlantic colonies were individualistic, entrepreneurial, and the northern tier of colonies, upper New England, were moralistic. Okay? And then when the United States declares independence in 1776, shortly after, the frontier begins to expand west. In fact, pretty consistently through the 19th century, right? And that when people moved west, as the frontier expanded westward, they did so basically on a pattern due west. So that the people who end up here in the northern tier, the upper Midwest, and then out here eventually to the Pacific Northwest, came from this part of the country. And people who ended up in Texas and Oklahoma, and then eventually out to New Mexico and Arizona, came from the Old South. Think about that for a second. Do you remember your Texas history lessons? Where did the early Anglo settlers in Texas come from? And by the way, when are we talking about? Like the Austin colony, right? Stephen F. Austin and Jane Long and Lamar and all those names that are really pretty prominent around here, okay? Historical names, right? Where did those people come? Did they come from Massachusetts? Did they come from New York? Well, they came from places like South Carolina and Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi. So when back in the 1820s, when Anglo-Americans packed up and moved out to Texas from South Carolina or Tennessee or wherever they didn't just pack up their material things and head out to Texas. They brought their values along with them, the things that they believed in. So we find that from the very beginning in Texas, in Anglo-Texas, the kinds of political institutions and political practices that are established are really very consistent with the kinds of political institutions and practices that existed here. That makes a lot of sense, right? And up here, right, and in the middle, you get that sort of migration pattern from east due west. All right, so I kind of like this pattern, right? All right, here's a second map. This shows not only the dominant culture type, that appears first, the letter that appears first, but also the subcultures, states that have subcultures. So again, your eye may immediately go to Texas, So Texas, we already know, has a dominant traditionalistic culture, but LSR says that there's also a very strong individualistic subculture in Texas. And again, pick your favorite state. You can kind of see what the subculture type is. How do you think he explains the fusion of subculture types into various areas of the country? If the dominant culture type, I'm going to give you a strongly worded hint here, okay? If the dominant culture type, that first letter, is established by patterns of migration basically due west, how do you think the subculture patterns are established?
By the opposite.
Well, what is the opposite? West to east?
Yes.
I don't think we've had too much west to east migration in the United States. I mean, as a general, obviously there are individual cases, right? But as a general rule, we haven't had migration in this direction. We've had 19th century migration in this direction. How's migration basically occurred in the 20th century? It's more north to south rather than east to west, right? So that in the 20th century, you get patterns of migration in this fashion, okay? So the infusion of individualistic subculture in Texas, that's from people in the 20th century coming from places like Ohio and Illinois and Michigan and, you know, those upper Midwest places, and bringing their values along with them. The greater Houston area is a great illustration of that point. You know, Houston, the city of Houston itself, the greater Houston area, experienced phenomenal growth in the 20th century. Was that growth due mainly to natural increase? Are any of you sociology students, sociology majors, or have aspirations to be demographers? They use a term called natural increase. Demographers call it natural increase. That's just the difference between the birth rate and the death rate. So here's the question I'm asking you. Is the growth of the greater Houston area in the 20th century mainly the result of a natural increase, the difference between the birth rate and the death rate? Or is it attributable to something else? It's attributable mainly to migration, people moving here from other parts of the country. And then towards the end of the 20th century and now in the 21st century, from other parts of the world, right? The city of Houston, the Houston area is one of the most cosmopolitan places in the country. Are you aware of that? Like, you know, the Harris County and eastern Fort Bend County, at least, among Sugar Land, one of the most diverse places in the country. But that's a relatively recent phenomenon. In the middle part of the 20th century, you basically had people coming to Texas and Georgia, the Sun Belt. Have any of you heard the distinction between the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt? You don't get that anymore. In the middle part of the 20th century, there were some major economic transformations that happened in the United States. You know, in the early part of the 20th century, the industry was up here. But by the time you get to the middle part of the 20th century, and certainly by the time you get to the 1960s and the 1970s, this is all rusting out. That's why they call it the Rust Belt, right? Like all these factories are going idle and people are getting laid off and in search of economic opportunity. They come to the sunny South. They come to Texas and Georgia and places like that, Florida and so on, looking for economic opportunity. But again, they bring their values with them. They don't just leave their values behind. Okay, so that is his explanation for the infusion of subcultures, more recent patterns, 20th century migration. What he's really interested in, though, is the phenomenon of localized political culture. And here's a map that shows M's and I's and T's distributed sort of at a local level. And you can see that, again, if we go first to Texas, you can see that there's a very interesting pattern, right? Lots of I's and T's there in Texas. But do you notice anything about the ordering and what it might suggest? Anything? Anybody see anything? Say again? What's the opposite? Where? So all over the map here in Texas, you see I's first and T's second? Any?
It's more on the east where it's more ice first, and then, or my bad, on the west, and then on the east is more T's first.
Yeah, if you draw a line, kind of use your mind's pencil in your mind's eye, right, or the marker in your mind's eye, and just sort of draw a line basically up the I-35 corridor, right, through San Antonio, Austin, and then up through Dallas-Fort Worth. On the eastern side of that line, the T's come first, suggesting a dominant traditionalistic culture and an individualistic subculture. And on the west side, the I's come first, suggesting dominant individualistic culture, traditionalistic subculture. So why, 2/3 of the landmass of Texas has a dominant individualistic culture? So why does he say it's a dominant traditionalistic culture? Is political culture a function of landmass, do you think, or is it a function of people? It's a function of people. So where are most of the people in Texas? They're east of that line, right? So since most of the people are east of that line and the dominant culture type is traditionalism, Texas has a dominant traditionalistic culture. But again, a very, very strong subculture, individualism. You really can't think about Texas without thinking about that strong individualistic subculture. Now, we haven't defined or described what he means by moralistic, individualistic, or traditionalistic yet, but I think one of the things that when we do here in just a second, one of the things that's going to sort of occur to you is that moralism and traditionalism are kind of at odds with one another. They're still liberal, so there's that, but within the context of liberalism, there's a very clear separation between moralistic and individualistic, and so that it makes it, there's kind of interesting. There's several points or several places here on this map where you can see T's and M's together. Right here, down here in South Texas, down here in Southern Florida, we got T's and M's and I's. Yeah, a little bit down here in Southern California, very southern part of California. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Everything that we've said about how these M's and I's and T's get distributed around the map, any thoughts about how he might explain the existence of moralism and traditionalism side by side in the same community? I went to graduate school at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Now, that was a long time ago, and so maybe it's changed. I don't think it has, though. But when I was out there in the 1980s, it was pretty clear to me that you had two different cultures existing side by side. In some ways, it was like Tucson was like it was depicted, film and television and so on, this old sort of old West feel, right? Very traditional kind of thing. But then it also had kind of almost a California type vibe to it as well. Any of you from that part of the country know what I'm talking about? Well, here's what I would suggest to you. The reason that this happens, and particularly in these places that we're talking about here, is because you have people who come down to those places, southern Arizona, southern California, even some in South Texas, but like southern Florida, mainly older people who can no longer take the frigid winters of Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, come down for 6 months out of the year. We call them the sunbirds. Or snowbirds, I'm sorry. We call them the snowbirds, right? They would come down during the winter months. But again, they didn't leave their values behind. They brought them along, right? So that's, I think, again, it's at least temporary migration. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about what he means by each of these three types. Let's just start with moralistic culture. As we've already established, it's primarily a phenomenon of the northern tier of states. That pattern was established by 19th century migration. How do people in moralistic communities view government, politics, and public policy? What's sort of the distinctive views that they have about government, politics, and public policy? Well, again, according to LSR, moralistic communities view government as a commonwealth, as a means to achieve the good of the community through positive action. So again, he's talking about a civic morality here. He's not talking about religious morality. What he's suggesting is that there's a sense in these communities that not only does government have an obligation to the community to provide for the good of the community, but the individuals in the community have an obligation to the community. Maybe state that a little bit differently. I think what he would say is that there's not this knee-jerk, even though it's liberalism, there's not this knee-jerk reaction in moralistic communities to government actions, like there is in some other parts of the country, maybe Texas, where there seems to be this knee-jerk reaction like, you've got to keep government out of everything to the greatest extent possible. That's not the view that he attributes to moralistic culture. Non-governmental action is preferred whenever possible. After all, it is liberal culture. But there's not this aversion to governmental action like you see in some parts of the country. Appropriate areas of public policy include any area that will enhance the community, although non-governmental action is preferred. Social as well as economic regulation is considered legitimate. New programs will be initiated without public pressure if they're believed to be in the public interest. So the public doesn't have to bang on the doors of the city hall or the legislature. We want change. We want that. It'll just happen because it's part of the expectations of the culture. Politics is viewed as a healthy civic enterprise. Everyone should participate. There's not this view that politics is unseemly. Political parties are viewed as vehicles to attain goals believed to be in the public interest. It's not just party for party's sake. Oh, and here's something very interesting. Third parties tend to be better received in moralistic communities. So, how many of you have taken the Government 2305 class? One of the things that you learn in the Government 2305 class is the United States has a dominant two-party system, right? Where the two dominant parties are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. That's been true throughout our history, two dominant parties. But that doesn't mean that we don't have other political parties, right? All LSR is saying here is that whereas in other parts of the country, it's going to be very rare indeed that anyone other than a Democrat or Republican gets elected to office. It does happen, at least from time to time, in moralistic communities. At least every once in a while. They're more viable. Third parties are more viable. In fact, some of our most important third party movements really began in the upper Midwest. The progressive reform movement, for example, in the early part of the 20th century, really began in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota. And if you're interested, you can go out and look at elected officials around the country, and occasionally you'll see somebody who's not a Democrat or Republican elected in one of these states to the state legislature, or even every once in a while to maybe a state governor. Have you ever heard the name Jesse Ventura? Anybody know the name Jesse Ventura? Probably not. It's probably too long ago. But Jesse Ventura became a celebrity name in this country back in the 1990s. He was a professional wrestler. Jesse the Body Ventura, they called him. And when he was done wrestling, WWE stuff, right? When he was done wrestling, he decided to run for governor of Minnesota as a Reform Party candidate. Not a Democrat, not a Republican, a Reform Party candidate. And you know what? He won. It is unthinkable that anyone other than a Democrat, well, really in these days, anyone other than a Republican is going to win the Texas governor's race. It's just not thinkable. Do we have third parties in Texas politics? Yes, but none of their candidates ever get elected because they're just not viable as candidates. Libertarian Party candidates, Constitutional Union Party candidates, La Raza Unida Party candidates, whatever but they just can't win office. But again, occasionally at least in the moralistic communities that will happen. Parties are viewed as vehicles to attain goals in the public interest. Elections, competition is over issues. Winning a public office is viewed as a greater opportunity to implement policy and programs. So again, it's that whole idea of civic moralism, right? Civic morality. That's the base. I mean, he writes a whole book. I can't cover everything, flush out everything that he says about moralistic culture, but these are sort of the basic ideas that he attributes to moralistic culture. Questions? Let's get down to traditionalism, because I said they were kind of like opposites, right, in a sense. Now, I wouldn't want to state that too strongly, okay, but at least in the context that we're talking about here, you can see that there's some very different ideas. So again, we're talking mainly about the South into the desert Southwest. What is the basic view that traditionalistic culture has about government, politics, and public policy? What are the basic ideas? Well, government is viewed as a means of maintaining the existing social, economic, and political order. Government is viewed as a means of maintaining the existing social, economic, and political order. In other words, I guess for lack of a simpler way to say it, Elzar is saying that there's a much more well-defined class structure in traditionalistic communities. And you have a few people, he means by elite dominated, you have a few people that have wealth, power, status, and government is just an instrument to maintain that. That's what traditional means, maintaining the traditional patterns in the distribution of wealth, power, and status. Appropriate areas of public policy include those that maintain traditional patterns. New programs will not be initiated unless they serve the interests of the governing elite, and that implies minimal government services. Elzar says that you should expect in traditionalistic communities for social welfare programs, for example, to be minimally funded. Education to be minimally funded. Anything that falls under that heading of social services, minimally funded. Taxes are going to be low. Why? Because to do otherwise, to have more expansive social services and to have higher taxes and so on, is to upset the existing order. Politics is viewed as a privilege. Only those with legitimate claim to public office should participate. Power is highly personal, based on family and social ties. In fact, he says in many traditionalistic communities, you tend to have one or two families that dominate the political, economic, and social life of the community. And that does seem to be a feature of the American South. It's less conspicuous in large urban areas, large metropolitan areas these days. I think you have to get out to more rural areas to really see that. But it does seem to be that, in the South you have, in many of these communities, you have one or two families that tend to dominate everything. Political parties serve as a means to recruit people to public offices not desired by established power holders. And look at this. Elzar says that a characteristic feature of traditionalistic communities is one-party politics. Now, back when Elzar wrote this book, initially, political scientists talked about the one-party South. They were referring to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was the dominant party. It was the one-party Democratic dominant. You had to be a Democrat in the South, Texas included, to be elected to office, for example. The first Republican that was elected to statewide office in Texas since the end of the Civil War, since Reconstruction. You know, that was the 1870s, right? From the 1870s, you didn't have another Republican elected to public office in Texas, in statewide office, until 1960, almost 100 years later, when John Tower, a Republican, was elected to the United States Senate from Texas. And then the first governor, the first Republican elected governor of Texas, from Reconstruction, was the last one, way back in the 1870s. You had a Republican governor of Texas, E.J. Davis. There was not another Republican elected governor until 1978, when Bill Clements was elected governor. Some of you probably went to the high school that bears his name. 100 years went by before you had a Republican. Well, now it's not one-party Democratic dominance, it's one-party Republican dominance. Are you aware of that? Did you know, for example, we'll have a chance to get into this in this course in more detail, but did you know that there hasn't been a Democrat elected to statewide office in Texas since 1994? They're all Republicans. The governor is a Republican. The lieutenant governor is a Republican. The comptroller of public accounts is Republican. The commissioner of the General Land Office is Republican. The Agriculture Commission is Republican. The Texas Railroad Commission is dominated by Republicans. The Texas Supreme Court is dominated by Republicans. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals is dominated by, they're all Republicans. But I think Ellisar would say it doesn't matter if it's one-party Democratic dominance or one-party Republican dominance. The point is that it's one-party dominance. And by the way, it's some of the same people. Are you aware of that? That in the 1980s, a lot of conservative Democrats, there used to be a such thing as a conservative Democrat. A lot of conservative Democrats jumped over to the Republican Party. Have you ever heard the name Rick Perry? Anybody ever heard the name Rick Perry? Who's Rick Perry?
He was a former governor of Texas.
He used to be the governor of Texas, the immediate predecessor to the current governor, Greg Abbott, right? Well, did you know that when Rick Perry, Mr. Republican Rick Perry, was first elected in Texas to office, he was a Democrat. He was elected to the state legislature, he was a Democrat. And then in the 1980s, things began to change very dramatically, and a lot of those conservative Democrats, like Rick Perry, went over to the Republican Party, right? But as I say, it really doesn't matter if it's one-party Democratic or one-party Republican. At least I don't think Ellisar would say that matters. Okay, competition tends to be between elite-dominated factions of a dominant party. The goal of winning public office depends on the political views of the dominant elite faction. Those are the basic characteristics of traditionalism. Any questions about that? All right, so we can finish this part of it up by getting the basic features of individualism out there. Because remember, Texas has a very strong individualistic subculture as well. So according to Ellisar, people in individualistic culture view government as a marketplace, as a means to respond efficiently to demands. Government essentially functions like a business, or should function like a business. That's the prevailing view in individualistic culture. In other words, government has its customers, it has its clients, if you will, and it should respond to demands efficiently. But more than that, appropriate areas of public policy are largely economic, encouraging private initiative and access to the marketplace. Economic development is given the highest priority. New programs will not be initiated unless demanded by a significant client of government. Like most businesses, we would expect maybe for government to have its preferred clientele. politics is viewed as dirty in individualistic communities. Left are those who are corrupt, or at least corruptible. And boy, you can point to some of these states that have individualistic cultures, dominant or subcultures, and some of them have some very colorful histories of political corruption, Texas included. Texas has a very interesting history. If somebody was to, I'm sure somebody has, but I'm not aware of it, just write a book on the history of political corruption in Texas. It would be a very interesting read. Illinois would be another state. Illinois has a dominant individualistic culture, pretty significant history of political corruption. New Jersey. Louisiana is kind of like Texas, dominant traditionalistic subculture individualism. Also, very interesting history of political corruption. And it's not that people in the individualistic culture like corruption. I don't think LSR is saying that. It's not saying they welcome corruption. I think it's just that they think that's the way it is and you can't do anything about it. That's just politics. Of course there's going to be corruption. It's politics. So it's sort of tolerated. By the way, he's not going to suggest, and I'm not going to suggest to you that you don't have corruption in moralistic communities. You do. Obviously, there could be cases of corruption, but I think what he would say is that when it does occur in moralistic communities, it's rooted out very quickly. Once detected, it's rooted out. Because that's not consistent with the civic morality. Political parties act as business organizations, doling out favors and responsibility. Party cohesiveness tends to be strong. That means party for party's sake. And then finally, elections. Competition is between political parties rather than over issues. The winning of public office is seen as the opportunity to attain and distribute tangible rewards. Okay, so those are the characteristics of traditionalistic political culture. Now, his book is not about Texas. Okay, I want to end on this point here. We got about 3 minutes, so let me get this in here real quick. Okay, his book is not about Texas, but there are a couple of places where he talks specifically about Texas, the traditionalism of Texas and the individualism of Texas. So, with respect to traditionalism, he says, in Texas, the preservation of cultural patterns manifests itself concretely in wide circles as anti-federal, anti-social welfare, anti-tax radicalism tied in with the very clear economic interests in the state. What in the world does he mean anti-federal? We don't like those people in Washington telling us how to do our business. Anti-social welfare? That's straightforward enough, right? We don't tend to embrace public welfare programs. He calls us anti-tax radicals. Nobody likes paying taxes, but apparently Texans really don't like paying taxes. So, you know, one of the things that he is suggesting by this is you should expect that in a place like Texas, with traditionalism as the dominant culture type, is minimal government services and low taxes. And our political leadership in Texas is always telling us about how Texas is a low tax state. The individualism of the Texas political culture, bottom line is economic development. You can't get Texans together, can't get Texans to agree on anything else. The one thing you can get them to agree on is the importance of economic development. What's good for business is good for Texas. Keep the taxes low, keep regulations to a minimum, create a good business climate. That's what Texas is about, right? That's what he's saying. Okay, questions? We're just about out of time, so we'll call it a day at that point. And, you know, one of the things that we should be able to do, if there's any validity to LSR's assertions about these culture types, we should be able to see something in the data, right? So that's what we're going to do in the video recording that you're going to have for Thursday, in the Thursday class meeting. We're going to look at some patterns in the data and see if there's any support for LSR's assertions. All right, so make sure you look for that Thursday video.